This is Dr. Karen, and you are listening to the Facto Leaders podcast on the B Podcast Network, where I share up-to-date, evidence-based practices, my own experiences, and guest interviews designed to help pediatric therapists, educators, and aspiring school leaders design services that support social, emotional, and academic growth and set kids up for success in adulthood. Whether you want to learn effective strategies for your therapy session or classroom, be an influential leader on your team, or find creative ways to use your skills to advance in your career, I've got you covered. Hey everybody, it's Dr. Karen, and welcome to episode 198 of the De Facto Leaders podcast on the B Podcast Network. Teachers and school leaders often feel like they have to be everything to everyone. Not only are educators expected to deliver high-quality instruction in traditional academic areas, they're also expected to provide social-emotional support, vocational training, and everything in between. When it comes to supporting mental health, this can be a tricky ethical line to walk when you're trained as a teacher and not as a clinician. Additionally, school staff are constantly trying to manage their own mental health needs, which is a challenge when the public tends to be unforgiving. That's why I invited Dr. Hayley Watson to episode 198 to talk about how to help teachers support mental health in a way that falls within their scope. Dr. Hayley Watson is the founder and CEO of Open Parachute, a Tier 1 K-12 curriculum program that supports the mental health of students, teachers, and parents. She is also an author and clinical psychologist and holds a PhD in school bullying interventions. She has been creating and delivering programs for youth and practitioners across the US, Canada, the UK, and Australia for the past 20 years. In this conversation, we discuss special education accommodations feel like extra work for teachers, but embedding mental health into Tier 1 curriculum solves this problem. Why talking about mental health in general education helps educate peers on diverse learning needs. Destigmatizing mental health and giving youth the language to talk about self-regulation and self-care. And we wrap up by talking about service delivery models and why we need both structured, explicit intervention and real-life practice in social-emotional curriculums. Be sure to check the show notes for all of the places you can go to connect with Dr. Watson and learn about her programs. And you definitely want to check out her TEDx talk called Youth Mental Health is Not as Complicated as We Make It Out to Be. So, as I said before, check the show notes. All of the resources and the places you can go to connect with Dr. Watson will be in those show notes. Finally, before we get started, I wanted to remind you to check out the School of Clinical Leadership, my program that helps related service providers develop a strategic plan for putting executive functioning support in place in collaboration with their school teams. What I have always aimed to do is support those practitioners who are delivering those Tier 3 and potentially Tier 4 interventions. So those providers who are trained as clinicians and who are thinking about how to deliver those direct interventions, but also thinking about how they can empower some of their partners. So the teachers, maybe the other therapists, so they can figure out ways that they can embed some of the strategies that they're working on in their direct therapy sessions into the other parts of students' day. So this goes really nicely with this conversation because part of your role when you are a related service provider is figuring out how you can support teachers at the Tier 1 level. Because as people often say, you can't fix a Tier 1 issue at the Tier 3 level. And helping teachers to feel empowered in their classrooms and giving them more tools in their toolboxes can actually help to support them when they get to the point when students do need those more intensive supports. So I show you how to think about all of those things in the School of Clinical Leadership, and you can learn more about the program at drkarendudek-brannan.com/clinical leadership. Now, please enjoy this conversation with Dr. Hayley Watson. Today, I am joined by Dr. Hayley Watson from Open Parachute. So, thank you so much for being here with me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, I thought we'd start off by just having you share a little bit about yourself. Like, what what kind of work are you doing now, and then what's the backstory? So, I guess we could do the quick intro, and then we could probably get into the longer one later. So.
For sure. So I am a clinical psychologist, and the work I'm doing, I've co-founded an organization called Open Parachute, which I run with my co-founder, Tom. And we create mental health programs for schools. So the whole goal being equipping students as well as teachers and parents with core skills that they really need in their lives to be able to thrive, both academically and just in their personal lives. So we're really trying to embed that mental health learning more at a tier 1 level. We do tier 2 and 3 as well, but the goal is really to help students have this skill set that helps them navigate challenges, whether they're little things that happen in their life, friendship challenges, or bigger traumas, but to have a skill set going in. So we're not waiting for something hard to happen and then providing an intervention or resources, really giving them that skill set or that toolkit.
Yeah. So I would love to get into the conversation about all the different tiers because it's so interesting. You know, a lot of the people who might be listening are really focused more on the tier 3, tier 2, and sometimes people even have a 4th tier if you don't consider tier 3 to be special ed yet. But I know that a lot of people, when they are trying to do more intensive services effectively, it's really hard to do if you don't have a robust tier 1 curriculum.
Yeah.
And, you know, it can really have some good downstream impacts on the more intensive interventions when you're starting with tier 1. Like how they say you can't fix a tier 1 issue with a tier 3 intervention and, you know, put it on all of the related service providers, even though we certainly need to utilize them in many cases.
Absolutely. I mean, it's like any other skill. If we start with a baseline that's non-existent, so we don't have tier 1 strategies, and then we're relying on, you know, those tier 2 and tier 3 and tier 4 strategies to come in, there's so much more you have to do if you don't have that kind of baseline. The analogy I use a lot of the time is students getting a driver's license, teenagers getting a driver's license. So we don't wait until they've had an accident and then we teach them a bunch of driving skills, which is kind of what, you know, relying only on tier 2 and 3 to do all the work. We have a tier 1 intervention. We teach every single student some really important driving skills because we know that they're going to be in a situation where they might get in an accident. We hope they don't, but we're preparing them. So the same thing goes. We need to give this skill set so that everyone has a base level of understanding. And then it also becomes much more clear which students need a bit more. And which which need more support. And the other part that I think is so important that we often forget about is those students who do need more support, they also need their peers to have an understanding and empathy and skills for how to relate to them and understand them and respond and all of those things. So if we're saying only the students that we see are struggling are the ones we're going to give an intervention to, then all of those other students don't have a skill set for not only when they struggle, but also how do I understand and relate to someone who is more on the end of the spectrum of struggling than me. Then we divide kids and they can't connect and support each other.
Yeah, that's a good point because I think it's twofold. And I know that sometimes I mean, people can be a little bit black and white with how they think about, do we teach others to accommodate and like be more supportive, or do we focus on teaching coping skills for the students who need to advocate for themselves or use strategies? And I think you need to do both. Like you need to raise awareness and have strategies for a lot of reasons, because that's life. You always need to know how to advocate for yourself. And you're going to be in situations where people aren't going to understand your needs, even if people do have good intentions and sincerely want to be accommodating. They just don't know. They just don't know you. And so you need to know how to navigate that on both sides. So,
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's so, so important. And, you know, the piece I always come back to is empathy. We all need more empathy. And the way we get to empathy is by self-analysis, understanding myself and my own emotions and my own reactions. And the more I've reflected on that, the more I can better understand someone else who might be having a big reaction that doesn't necessarily make sense to me, but I can probably understand the emotion that's underneath it because that's universal. And so the more we can help students do that self-reflection and that skill building in themselves, it just helps them connect to others so much better, regardless of what they're facing.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. So I'm curious like, I know you've had a really interesting career trajectory that led you to the work that you're doing now. And you have a great TED Talk, which we'll definitely link to, but why, like, what led you to pick the career that you did initially? And then I know you've made some pivots, like you picked one thing and then you went to another, like you realized that, and I think that a lot of people have that, you pick one thing and you realize that you want to go a different direction, or maybe you want to do something different. So yeah, I'd love to hear all about that.
Absolutely. So I started my career or my education in criminology. So I was really interested in catching bad guys. And that came from having experienced some serious trauma when I was young, which I go into sort of more detail in that TEDx talk. But my family was attacked by someone who we didn't know who this person was. They bombed our house with dynamite a number of times, so 5 times over the period of a year and a half. So when I was very, very young, there was this unknown, we called him the boogeyman. I mean, I don't even know if it was a man, but of course we gendered him as a man back then. Somebody was terrorizing us. And so I had this image of like bad people. There's bad people out there who do bad things. And so I think that's why I was really fixated on, crime and why do people do what they do? And that was the burning question that I had. Why do people do horrible things? Because it didn't make any sense to me. Why, I was this tiny girl when this happened. I was sort of 2 years old, and that stays with you. And so I think that's what really started that career trajectory. And I was in the police department for a little while, and I was really interested in that. But throughout the course of that education, it was a great, eye-opening education. What I realized is there aren't bad people. There are systems that don't work for people, and there are challenges that people face, and they're not supported with those challenges. And so they end up making really horrible decisions, but that doesn't mean they're bad people. And so throughout the course of that, I started to my eyes started to be opened a little bit. And then I mentored a young girl who was in the justice system. So she had, she was 14 and she'd already, committed a lot of crimes and sort of was going down that path. And having that firsthand account of her life and just the horrific challenges she faced and the lack of support she had and the lack of just genuine people who cared about her was so heartbreaking. It was such a powerful experience for me to witness that. And that really hit home for me. This is my sort of life's work, or my passion is not how do I catch the people who are doing the bad things and put them away from society. How do I coach and guide and nurture and create systems that coach and guide and nurture every young person so that when they are faced with those challenges, they don't go down that path where they're harming themselves and harming others. And if they do start going down that path, how do we pull them back? And so that's what sort of led me to then pursue psychology and get a PhD in bullying interventions, and really led me to sort of developing these school-based resources, because really schools are the place if you're really trying to make big change in the world. And that's our motto. We want to create generational change by teaching mental health skills. And I really truly believe that that's possible, because no matter what we've been through, no matter what challenges we faced, if we learn a skill set, like you said earlier, if we learn that skill set to advocate for ourselves, to understand what's happening in us, why we're feeling the way we're feeling, it's a lot of work to retrain our brain after trauma. It is. But when we do that work, there's such freedom and agency and power, because we know, for the rest of our lives, anything hard that happens, we can overcome it. And so that belief in the self is what leads us to be able to make good decisions for ourselves and for other people. And so that's, I guess, where that personal part, I think we all start our career trajectory and from a personal place, what am I interested in? That's sort of how it veered into, oh, this is really where I belong and where I can really make the most difference.
I know you spent some time as a clinical psychologist and you were doing the treatment side before you came to working with the schools. So there's the forensic to clinical psychology to focusing on the mental health in the schools in tier 1.
Yeah.
What led to making the transition from clinical psychology to tier 1 interventions? Because I can see how you make the switch from, like you said, putting bad guys away to being proactive and providing those mental health services. But then there was another shift where you're addressing it from a different angle. So what made you make that shift?
Absolutely. So it's interesting. And I love the question because it really was ultimately, now when I look back on it, I can see, oh, I know why I wanted to make that shift. When I was in it, I didn't actually have that insight. And so I do like to share this part of that story because just for anyone listening who is finding themselves in somewhere similar. So when I zoom out and I look at it now, I can go, I could sense that I wasn't making as big of an impact. That's really what the goal is. And I think that's what I realized only after the fact, though, is that I didn't want to just, when you're a psychologist, you can only see one person at a time. And there was just this sense in me that I wanted to have a greater impact. And it was that feeling of, so I'm seeing one student in a class and I'm able to work with them and really make significant changes in their lives. But then they're surrounded with the whole peer group that doesn't get this. And so, wanting to change the world, essentially, wanting to have a bigger ripple effect. But what's important, I think, to think about is at the time, I didn't realize any of that. What I experienced was feeling burnt out. And I think that's just an interesting reflection. Whenever I reflect on that, I was feeling burnt out and overwhelmed, and I didn't know why. And I didn't know what was next. It wasn't sort of a seamless, when you look back on it, you can easily say, oh, she knew what she wanted to do and blah, blah, blah. But I really didn't. I really just knew something's not working. I'm doing what I thought I wanted. I trained so long for this and I'm here, I'm in it. And why don't I love it? And I loved my clients and I loved the work, but why am I feeling so burnt out? Why am I, not thriving in this experience? And so it was a walking away and a letting go of that to I had no idea what. I had no idea how I was going to do any of the things that I did. And I started off wanting to write a book for teenagers. I thought maybe I'll write a book. And then all the teenagers that I worked with were like, we do not read books. Don't write us a book. Bad idea. So it was my clients that suggested I start a YouTube channel. They were like, start a YouTube channel.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
So through starting the YouTube channel, I started interviewing young people because I was like, well, these are the people we want to hear from. And then through doing those interviews, I started to realize I always knew how wise young people were, but how well they were able to articulate themselves and how well they were able to guide their peers. And so those videos, I started thinking, imagine we could get these out to more kids, and started bringing them into schools. And then that led to the program. So I think, it's that moment in your life or your career where you don't know what's coming next, but it was sort of one of those leap of faith. I was sort of just gave up my practice and just said, I was living in Australia at the time. So I'd say I went on walkabout. I just said, I'm going and I'm going to try doing something that I love, and I don't really know what's coming. And then it just led to all of the things that I'm doing now.
Yeah, that's so interesting how burnout is I think people can oversimplify burnout and think, oh, you're just overworking or you're doing too much and you just need to take a break. And I think it's more about, I guess, partially finding meaning in the work or doing the work that you want to be doing, even if it is hard. Because if you oversimplify burnout, it's like, oh, I'm just doing too much. And
Yeah.
yes, even if you do work that is aligned with what you want to be doing, you can certainly burn out that way from overworking and doing too much. But
Mm-hmm.
if you just take a break, it's like, I still have to go back to this
Yeah.
job that maybe isn't quite what I want to be doing. And it's
Yes.
kind of a Band-Aid that I
Yeah.
always it seems like
Exactly.
your weekend breaks or your self-care is just a Band-Aid if you're
Yes.
not doing something that you look forward to going back to.
I love it. I love it. It's that inquiry of why.
Yeah.
That's the question we always try to teach in our programs too. Not just how can I soothe myself right now, but how can I understand why I'm feeling this way? Because there's always going to be so many layers to it. And sometimes we're overworking and we're also not doing the right thing. So it's like really, you have to like peel back those layers.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think the other thing is that if there are certain times when you can tolerate more hard work, like
Yes.
it's not just about the
Hmm.
work is too hard and we need to take a break. It's what kind of hard work do I want to be doing?
Yes.
And that
Yeah.
makes it more tolerable. It helps you
Hmm.
push through discomfort.
Hmm.
And because, I mean, there are things where you just think, you know what, it's just not worth it. I don't care enough that I want to go through
Yeah.
whatever it is that I need to do this. And I think it's not always it's a healthy thing to teach kids to
Hmm.
say, like, you can love to do something and not love every second of it. Sometimes it's
Yes.
okay for it to be hard, but
Yes.
finding that balance of, well, you don't want to just give up right away because it's hard, but
Hmm.
why is it hard? Or like,
Yeah.
is it just
Yeah.
a temporary this
Yeah.
one thing that I don't like doing about my job or
Yeah.
my
Absolutely.
whatever activity it is that you're doing. Like, I mean, thinking about sports,
Hmm.
I know when you're talking to kids, and I love to use, soccer or basketball or any type of game where the
Hmm.
fun thing is playing the game. What, like, my husband used to coach youth soccer and they'd always be like, we want to scrimmage. And he's like, well, you can't scrimmage if you can't handle the ball. So like you have to do the boring drill things that you might not like so you can do the thing that you love. So
Hmm. Absolutely. And I think it's that thing of how do we teach kids to align to their values? Because if you are aligned to your values, if you're doing something that is part of a bigger story in your life or something that really lights you up or something that you feel so passionately about, you can find endless energy for it.
mhm.
And that's that grit part of, I can make it through this hard bit because I know it's worth it. And that's very different from just slogging it out at something that is not really aligned with what you want to do. And your life is hard, but for no greater purpose in your mind. Everyone's very personal what a greater purpose might be, whether it's the impact you want to have or just the things that you enjoy. But it's a very complicated topic and a really important one because I think a lot of us do feel burnt out in the world we live in. And it's really important to weed that out, what
Yeah.
is really going on here and how much is just overload versus I'm not quite making the right decisions right now for myself.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think sometimes things can be the right decision and then maybe 5 years later they're not.
Yes,
I
which is what
mean,
makes it even more complicated. Yeah, it's a
yeah.
constant reevaluating and
Mhm.
questioning.
Well, I went through a similar transition with going from direct clinical practice.
Mhm.
I was in the schools and feeling that where it was the right decision for a while, and then it was
Mhm.
time to make a transition, and then I did switch to more of the online learning and the training for clinicians. So not exactly what you're offering, but similar format where
Mhm.
it's still providing technology, using technology to reach
Mhm.
more people with your teaching, and it's about building the skill sets of clinicians, which I know that what you do, you offer trainings or and things that kids can access, but a lot of it is about empowering the teachers to have those skills. So can
Yeah,
you talk a little bit about that and just specifically some of the programs that you offer, how they're set up, why you've
yeah,
set them up the way that you have, and yeah, I have
absolutely.
tons of questions about
Yeah.
that once we go there.
Oh, absolutely. So our programs, for the most part, are teacher led. So the teacher is logging into our platform and they are running lessons with their students. And there is a specific reason we set it up that way. Two sort of sides of it. One side of it is that when students are logging in themselves and doing anything themselves, it's not that there's no value in that, but what we specifically are trying to help students with is a skill set that involves interacting with others. It's a skill set that involves, and especially at that age, peers are everything. So we want them to be like, a lot of the exercises are, get together with a partner, do group work. Like, we're really trying to build up that skill set so that they can not only be understanding themselves and their emotions and their thoughts, but they can communicate those things, because that is a really important part of the learning. So that's one of the reasons that we do it as a whole class. The other reason is that teachers right now are under so much pressure in terms of what's happening with mental health in students. So we have this whole generation of kids that are, a lot of them are struggling, and teachers know that, and they feel that, and they see it, and they're front line, but they feel under-resourced. They feel like they don't have a skill set because they're not given a skill set. And this is one of the tragedies of what's happening in education right now. And I can see that it will change, but it hasn't yet. So we have this whole group of teachers that don't necessarily feel equipped to be able to support students, to have conversations with students about mental health. And so the reason why we love our lessons to be teacher-led is it helps the teacher also have a framework. So we call it professional learning in the classroom. So teachers don't have to have in-depth training to run our programs. It's really accessible. It's based around student voice. So there's videos of students that are really the sort of deep way of peeling back the layers of what happens for a young person when they're struggling. There's clinical psychologists giving the breakdown. So again, the teacher in the room isn't there having to be the expert. There's this like real life experience that the students get to watch, that the teacher gets to watch. And then the teacher is facilitating the exercises that follow that are all pre-prepared. So it's a way for teachers to practice this skill set, to really start having some of these conversations with their students in a way that doesn't put the pressure on them that they have to be the expert or they have to know anything about this going in. So it's sort of teachers and students learning together, as it were. And I really feel very passionate about that piece too, because we have to support our teachers and we have to provide them with that understanding and skill set, because otherwise they're just out there alone and it's not that we can prevent them from dealing with student mental health, because it's in their face. So it's this bridge of how do we upskill and support teachers at the same time as upskilling and supporting students in a way that feels fun and engaging. So it's not, heavy on Pro-D training and heavy on things that are hard to retain or hard to action. It's about how do we relate to each other in the classroom? How do we understand human struggle? And how do we sort of overcome it together? So that's the bulk of our lessons. And then we do have teacher well-being content, and we do have further teacher training content, and we do have parent resources. So we have a whole suite of other resources around it, but the core of the program is really this curriculum content for how do we enable and support teachers to be upskilling their students in this really sort of important mental health skill set.
I'm going to take a quick break here to talk about the School of Clinical Leadership, my program that helps related service providers design programming and interventions to support students' executive functioning in school settings. Social skills groups are often seen as the entire intervention. And when they're delivered this way, they're often done in an academic format where an adult is leading the session and kids are answering questions or discussing various social rules and scenarios. This is a very small piece of what needs to happen. When we think of social skills intervention as just a lesson plan or social skills group, kids get really good at answering questions about how they should be acting in hypothetical situations. However, they often don't transfer any of those things over to real life. This is because real social interactions are not academic situations. We're actually not working on the skills preventing kids from using the information and knowledge we're trying to give them. In other words, we're not building the executive functioning skills kids need to be successful in social situations, not to mention other areas of life. Before you can successfully implement social skills intervention, you need to have a solid understanding of what executive functioning is, both the internal skills and the external behaviors, what successful intervention looks like and who needs to be involved, and what service delivery models can effectively address executive functioning. This is exactly what I show you how to do in the School of Clinical Leadership. In the program, you'll learn why kids continue to experience anxiety or behavioral challenges, even though they're going to therapy or have a behavior plan, common mistakes multidisciplinary teams make when teaching executive functioning, and how to correct these mistakes, why kids struggle with problem solving and friendships, even though they're going to pull out therapy and social skills groups, and most importantly, how to help your team work together to figure out solutions to all of these things. If you are in a related service provider role, if you're a speech pathologist, social worker, counselor, psychologist, occupational therapist, or other professional on a school team supporting students, you can emerge into a leadership role on your team and help to guide these interventions. I help you do that in the School of Clinical Leadership. To learn more about the program, you can go to drkarendudek-brannan.com/clinical leadership. Yeah, what I love about that is, and this is a conversation that I'm thinking about that I had with a previous guest, and I cannot remember the episode name, but we'll link to it, but with a guest, Jolita Johnson, who is a reading specialist, former and math specialist. And what she said was, when you're thinking about a curriculum or you're thinking about implementing something that is created by an ed tech company, which I would consider myself an ed tech company because I'm doing online learning, and there's so I think that the distinction is that the user of the curriculum is the teacher, not the student.
Yes.
And she made that distinction because a lot of times we're like, oh, it's all about the students. But then what we do is we bypass this critical process of what this product needs to do is almost provide scaffolding for the teacher to guide them. It's not doing the lesson for them, but it's giving them just enough structure that they feel confident. And yes, they can use their critical thinking skills, but it's narrowing the playing field, because if you give them nothing, especially with something like mental health, where they're not clinical psychologists or social workers or counselors, and they don't have that background, it's just giving them that guidance. And I think that that's where people get a little funny about curriculum, where they're like, it's too cookie cutter. But at the same time, I know I have clinicians all the time who are like, I just want a curriculum because it's so overwhelming to figure out what I need to do. And I mean, if people who have clinical training are saying that, I'm sure that the teachers are definitely saying that. And then the other thing that I often hear, and this is more with parents, a lot of times they'll say something like, what apps are there that are good for building kids' language skills? And I'm like, well, if you want to build your kids' language skills, it's not from using an app, it's from having interactions. But I think where you could find this middle ground is that if you were to create some kind of a technology or an application to build a skill like, again, mental health, social emotional learning, language, communication, it would need to be for the person who's doing the facilitation. Like, give the parent a tool that would help them figure out, like, during the day, how they might like facilitate language skills. Not let's give the kid an app and a device and put that in front of them, because that's exactly the opposite of what we want to be doing especially for early language. So, but do you have any videos where the students are interfacing? I know that it's primarily about the teachers, like it's really about supporting the teachers, but there's certainly times when students are directly interacting with like the curriculum.
Yeah, absolutely. So the way we've designed it is it's an online platform. So the teacher logs in and they pull it up on a screen in front of the class. And so the students together watch a mini documentary video of a peer their age going through something challenging, and really kind of they get to see the layers of that and their story. And then the clinical psychologist comes on to kind of help break it down and say, this is what's happening. And so they all engage in that together. So they're not on their own device, but they're all on a sort of a shared device in the classroom. And then there's a series of slides, a little bit like a PowerPoint presentation. So again, the students are engaging with that, but together as a group. And so that's how we have really felt that technology can be a huge asset in this space, is that we do have that interface and we do have that content, but it is still bringing people together, because after that, all of the slides that come up, the teacher, again, like you said, the teacher can follow an exact script if they want, if that's what makes them feel comfortable. They can also completely twist it around and change it if they have, a skill set around this, or they have pre-existing knowledge, or they want to tie it into a recent event that's happened and they want to talk about that. So they have total flexibility of sort of how they deliver that. But then there's this guidepost of, okay, here's some exercises that you can use with your class that will build a skill set that's related to the video they just watched. So we're just heard about someone who was picked on by a friend, for example, in one of the younger grades. How did they cope with that? What did that feel like? What was the impact of that? And then what did they do to help themselves? Let's practice that skill set so that everybody knows, if I'm picked on by a friend, I can understand what's happening and I can understand what to do about it. So it's sort of that, the use of technology, which is great, but not having it separate or divide the kids, having it actually, bring them together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think just having it be the group is watching it and it's not you're on your individual devices. I remember one time I was doing a review of something that was like an ed tech curriculum. I was supposed to be giving feedback and they were talking about, oh, it's so interactive. And the kids were just looking at their screens and not, interacting with each other, but they were interacting through the screens while they were sitting next to each other. It's like, know about this, like, and again, it was just a clip. Maybe there was more to it than that, but it just, I didn't love it.
Yeah, I know. And it's one of those challenging things because technology, I mean, there's so many things that are going to be happening and that are happening already. And it's hard to even imagine all of the applications of it. But there is still, especially from a mental health side, there is such a need, almost more so now in schools, to be practicing the interaction, because a lot of kids then go home and they don't have any interaction with anyone in real life. They are on a screen and that's the only way they're interacting. So if we don't take the one opportunity we have where we know kids are together to practice that skill set, what is going to happen to their overall ability to have those relationships and have that connection and be able to communicate? We all saw what happened after kids were isolated. Those ripple effects are still there.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the really important things for people who are working with parents. I know many of my colleagues who are doing more in the parent support are very much about providing kids with those real life experiences outside of school, because obviously if we are school staff, we can provide guidance, but it's really the parents that have to be providing those experiences or providing some boundaries around what screen time looks like outside of school. So that kids develop a lot of interests outside of their devices. So what do you like? I know that when we've got this group interaction, and one of the biggest challenge that a lot of people have shared with me who are doing more of those, I guess you could say tier 2, tier 3 interventions with things like social skills and social emotional learning, carryover is often a challenge. And I think part of it is the service delivery model that they're using, where, for example, you have a school psychologist who is there. The administration wants them to do a social skills group with a group of kids who are like, they all have IEPs. So you have all of these students in this isolated group that meets like 1 or 2 times a week, and they do a social skills lesson and then they kind of are sent off. And I don't think I know anybody who uses that model that has said that they get good generalization, but at the same time, they're like, well, this is still a challenge for all these students, so we've got to do something. So how do you get to that generalization piece when you've got like these, because it requires so many application skills and there's so many nuances to social situations that it's not something you can teach very academically.
It's a great point. So I would say both are needed. So I would say that you can teach it academically, but you also need to practice it a lot of times. So I think both things are true. I think what I see a lot of, and I get this, the sentiment of wanting to get away from a classroom lesson and more embedding that skill building throughout. And I would caution against leaving the lesson altogether, because like anything else, if we don't, it's sort of like there's a lot of understanding, not just application. So when you think about, for example, a bullying dynamic. So when we're trying to support kids who are bullied, we absolutely want to reinforce to them across the school day, how to stand up for themselves, how to, speak up when something hard is happening, how to communicate their needs to other people, how to ask for help, how to self-soothe. All of these things we want to be reinforcing. And so we want to make sure that that skill set is not just in one class, but multiple teachers are reminding them, and maybe their peers are reminding them, and their parents are reminding them, so that they get that practice. But if we don't also sit down and talk about, let's unpack bullying in a conscious, academic, critical thinking kind of way, then we never really truly understand and teach kids, when someone's bullying me, it's because they're in pain. And it's not actually about me. And I can understand the bullying dynamic, and I can understand all of these layers of complexity, which then help me to actually apply those skills. So I would say it's like both things are needed. So to circle back to your question of how do we do that, it's actually one of the things that we're working on right now, is because it's much more complicated in a school system. Because if you have a class, in a way that's hard. It's always hard to find time for a class, but at least it's sort of timetabled and it's something that, can be, you can see if it's happening or not. And it's sort of a bit more obvious. We're calling it sort of explicit learning versus implicit learning. So there's it's the obvious piece where it's a class. Is that being run with fidelity? But then how do you actually track and embed all of those reminders? And so this is one of the things, again, we have lots of things ongoing of how to do this. I think this is a challenge that we're all going to have to collectively figure out for probably a long time, that are trying to do this. It's one, training. So obviously that's where the teacher training comes in, and that let's make sure not only just the person who's teaching the lesson has this skill set, but everyone does. And also creating, so in our training, what we have is training that is not about the lessons themselves, but just about in general, when you're in your everyday interactions with students, how can you support their mental health in incidental ways? So there's that one piece. And then the other piece is making sure that whatever lesson you've taught is reminded. Students are reminded of that. And so that piece, and that's one of the things a lot of what our teachers do, especially in the younger grades, is when something happens, and this is part of just the instructions for teachers, but when something happens on the playground, for example, reminding students, this is just like that video we watched. And that's where the videos are so helpful, because they're situational. And so it's easy for teachers to sort of go, wait a minute, how did Alicia handle this in the video? Let's watch the video again. Or what did we learn about what to say to someone? Or when we feel anxious, what did we learn? And it's that reminder piece. So that's the way we are encouraging schools and districts to use it, is making sure that there's those consistent reminders. And it does get easier when there's a story around it, when there's sort of a real life situation. It's not so sort of, I guess, dry and academic. It's, hey, these are the kids that we know have been through this. What did they do? But then there's that wider training piece to make sure everyone is upskilled for what to do on sort of that day-to-day basis. And again, this is where it's tricky, because really what also needs to happen is that educator training programs need to be teaching this skill set. And so we're kind of backpedaling, all of us that are in this, trying to support schools to say, okay, how do we then as outside providers provide this level of training that they might not have time for it in a district. Every district has different requirements. The teachers might not feel like it's part of their role, and fair enough. And so how do we, there's a lot of barriers in that way, but these are the ways that we are approaching it and really trying to embed that it has to be whole school. It has to be that attitude of, we're not just running some lessons, but we are really trying to build a culture around this. So what can we do as teachers? What can we do as administrators? We have to have that buy-in from the top. What can we do throughout the day? So again, we have lots of resources around that, but it always is a conversation with the district, because not everyone's going to be able to use everything. And so it's sort of not, you can't really have a cookie cutter approach. Well, you can have sort of best practices and say, well, this would be the best outcome if you do all of these things. But we also have to meet each district where they're at, because they might have less time available. They might have teachers who have less exposure to this, so need a little bit more time to get used to it. So it really is, and I do find that process actually fun to say, okay, let's figure out where you're at as a district, and then let's build your individual plan for how do you get from where you are to the outcomes you really want, to becoming a district that is thriving and your students are thriving, and you have, and maybe that takes you 5 or 10 years, and that's okay. But let's take the steps knowing where we're headed, but also not trying to just in 1 year overhaul everything and expect that to come, have the results that we're looking for. So education is complicated. I don't have to tell you that, but there's so many layers to it.
Yeah, I think part of what is, I'm asked to do trainings in districts, and I know many of my colleagues are as well, or people who are creating curriculums. The challenging part is that, like to me, when we're working one-on-one with the client, right, you do an evaluation and then you come up with a treatment plan. Mm-hmm. But then when we're asked to do professional development, we're just supposed to guess at what the district needs. Like, that doesn't make any sense. You would need to do a program evaluation to diagnose where they are, to figure out what's their plan for what training you'd need to bring to the table. And obviously you have your protocols that you would use where you can plug it in, but then you can customize.
Yes.
And I completely agree about needing both. And needing kind of the academic or explicit. I refer to it as front loading, because you do need to prepare kids. And maybe there are some, I don't want to say canned, but there are the common scenarios, how do I start a conversation with someone? How do I know if somebody, I'm talking too much about a topic and the other person doesn't seem interested? Or how do I know if someone's bullying me? The typical things that you'd need to teach about, but then pulling in a real life situation that has to do with them. And that's where I worry a little bit, that just in some of the conversations that I'm hearing about the social emotional learning and the mental health, where yes, we need to have those experiences where kids are applying, but we know that a lot of students, especially the ones that do end up on caseloads, for example, need things to be taught explicitly. And it's one of those things that is essential for some, but beneficial for all.
Yes.
So you can't necessarily just only rely on implicit learning, because we know that that's going to leave so many kids out. And so when people are social skills groups are, it's just, let's just completely throw them out. And I'm like, no, the way that a lot of people do social skills groups, we need to probably need to adjust, or maybe throw out the way that they're doing it. But if we use it as a tool to prepare for other situations, and then have a plan in place for the reminders, and there's this nice streamlined system where everybody's involved, versus just they get pulled out of the room and the teacher doesn't have any idea what the psychologist or the SLP is doing in there, then of course it's not going to work, and it's going to be very canned.
Absolutely. And I think of it even a little bit like learning English, or any language, really. You have to, we have classes where you explicitly learn the language and the breakdown and blah, blah, blah. But kids really understand language by speaking it. And so all of their teachers speak it. And, I'm Canadian originally, so I did French immersion. Your teachers are speaking French to you, and that's the only way. And your peers are speaking a language. And so it's the same thing with mental health. We need to be teaching it, but then we also need the whole collective, the parents, all the educators, the administrators. We all need to be using this new language, and mental health is a new language, so that we're constantly reminding and dropping in, ooh, what's a strategy you've learned? How could you apply it here? How could you think about that differently? Have you, those kinds of pieces that, just we need to immerse them in that reality, and they will pick it up very quickly. The mind is very malleable, especially when we're young. And that's the part that's really exciting, is we do have this generation of kids that is exposed and has this language and dialogue and self-reflection ability that I certainly didn't have when I was young. And that's the exciting part about what we're doing, all of us that are working in this space, that are, there's so many different versions of how we're teaching kids this skill set, and it's having an impact, and that's really exciting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, it's so different from when I was going through school. So even just with the language and vocabulary, I know that is something that it's an interesting topic, because a lot of students, this is something that I hear a lot from parents, teachers, clinicians who are working with students who are autistic or have ADHD, and they are showing some of those like avoidance behaviors because they've realized things are hard and they don't have the strategies to work through those situations. And a lot of times whoever the adult is supporting the kids will say, like, he won't talk about it. He needs to process his feelings, and he won't do it. And I'm just wondering, and I know it's different for like boys and girls, and like the genders can respond differently to wanting to talk about feelings, and there's different levels of what is socially acceptable for men versus women, all of that. So I guess my first question would be, if you have students who maybe have neurodevelopmental differences that make it hard for them to put words to emotions. I know like some autistic adults that have said, I don't like these feelings, words don't make sense to me. I know what they mean because I interact with neurotypical people, so I have to have an understanding, but it's not how I describe what I'm feeling. Like I can think of one example of an adult who was like, I don't say happy, sad, overwhelmed. I just say I'm on or I'm off, like I'm alert or I'm done and I need to go take a break. And that was just what worked for her. So like, how do you adjust when you have students who don't have the language skills, or the emotion words don't necessarily make sense to them, but they maybe still do need to come up with some coping strategies for the situations that they're coming up for them?
Yeah, absolutely. Really great question. And I think it comes back to, we all have such a varied skill set and, varied experiences, varied knowledge levels. All those things are so, so different. But we also have this shared human experience where we struggle. And when we struggle, we feel things. And when we feel things, we usually react in ways that are not great because we have thoughts in our head that are not that helpful. So it's those core things that are constant in all of us. And then, so the skill set that we want to teach is about that core piece. And then we want to encourage each student to be able to figure out what that means for them. So there's nothing wrong with